Welcome back. This factoring lesson, we're going to talk about taking out a GCF first. Now, what I mean by GCF is a greatest common factor. So, greatest common factor, what that means is if every term in these quadratics I'm looking at, if every term can be divided by the same number, then you can pull that number out front first. Okay? So let's take a look at what I mean by that. Well, let's take a look at that first one, 2x squared plus 8x plus 6. So in order to factor this, you may notice first, each of those is an even number. And by being an even number, that means each of them is divisible by 2. So I'm going to take that 2 and I'm going to pull it out front. So every one of those terms now, every one of those numbers, I'm going to divide by 2. Now dividing the 2 doesn't impact the x at all. All it impacts are the numbers. 2 divided by 2 is just 1, so I don't have to show it. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So I factor out that 2 first. And now my job for my real factoring is that much easier. Because now when I break this down into my 2 parentheses, what makes my x squared? Well, x squared is made by x and x. What makes my 3? Well, there's only one combination that works. We're talking about 1 and 3. And then always a good idea to double check. So make those connections. 1x and 3x does in fact give you the 4x you were looking for, and that means that that is the end of your problem. You are finished. Now let's look at the next one. So again, always be cognizant if a number divides out first. 3, -9, and -30. What you might notice is a 3 divides out of each of those. So I'm going to pull a 3 out. And again, dividing out a number does not impact the powers whatsoever. It does not impact the x. I just take it out of each of the numbers. So 3 divided by 3 is just 1. So I just have a 1x squared. -9 divided by 3 is -3. So it leaves me just a -3x. -30 divided by 3 leaves me with a -10. Now again, by pulling out that 3, now my job of splitting it up is that much easier to split it up into my 2 parentheses. X squared, well that's coming from x and x. 10 comes from 1 and 10, or 2 and 5. But again, to multiply it to be -10, we're talking about having a plus and a minus. I need one of each to multiply it to be a negative. So which one of those adds to -3? Well, if I need to make one of them negative, if I have a +2 and a -5, let's look at what happens. I have a 2x, I have a -5x, and that does in fact leave me with a -3x. So once again, that means I'm finished with this problem. I am completely done. For this next one, 5 and -45. Now hopefully you recognize both of those can actually be divisible by 5. You can pull a 5 out of both. 5 divided by 5 is just 1, so I'll leave me with a 1x squared. -45 divided by 5 leaves me with a -9. Now, I want you to notice what just happened here. Let's look at what's left. I have 2 terms, a negative, and this term right here is one of those special numbers. It's a perfect square. So I hope you can see this is actually a setup for the difference of squares. The difference of squares, remember, I always start by putting my basic pattern down, the plus and the minus, split up my x, I apologize, I almost did that wrong. Into x and x, split up my 9 into 3 and 3. So again, it's a really easy way to factor as long as you remember and recognize the patterns when they appear. And our final one for today, 4x squared plus 14x plus 6. So if you notice, again, all of these are even numbers. So for even numbers, that means a 2 can pull out of each of them. 4 divided by 2 leaves me with 2. So I have a 2x squared. 14 divided by 2 leaves me with 7. So it leaves me with a 7x. 6 divided by 2 leaves me with 3. All right, and now let's continue to break this down. So now I'm going to break it down into my two parentheses. Well, 2x squared. So remember, this is the case. Now that's not just x and x. To get a 2x squared, that means I'm going to need a 2x and an x. To get 3, luckily there's only one combination that works, a 1 and a 3. We just have to make sure we put it in the right way. So let's plop it in as is and see if my combinations work. So this gives me a 1x, that gives me a 6x. Those do add to the 7x that I'm shooting for. So that does mean I am done with that problem. And that means we are done with these notes. So again, as always, please make sure you have all of this written down. And then please come and see me if you have any questions.